living on Cape Cod, you're never far from the beach. And growing up on the Cape, obviously I spent lots of time at the beaches, just looking out, staring out over the waves and watching the boats pass by. Only when I got older, like in college, did I learn about how many shipwrecks have been all around the Cape, especially on the outer Cape, the Great Beach, the Atlantic Ocean facing beaches. And in my lifetime, especially in the last few years, I've seen a few boats get washed up on jetties and have to be towed out, like the Ruth and Gale at Sassuat Harbor in 2010, or most recently the Artemis on the Provincetown breakwater in 2018. Even the Steamship Authority ferry has run aground on a jetty recently. But in my lifetime, going back, I was born in 1977, I don't think there's been any more of a famed, well-known ship grounding than that of the Eldia out on Nauset Beach. And I wanted to talk about it on this week's podcast because it was 37 years ago this week that it was floated off the beach. For those of you that are around my age and definitely older, I'm sure that if you grew up on the Cape, you remember this event. But in order to get a fuller scope of this story, we got to start at the beginning, and that was a huge storm. On March 29th, 1984, an early spring blizzard roared across New England with winds that touched hurricane force and were steady between 35 and 65 miles an hour. This storm is also known for destroying Great Point Lighthouse out on Nantucket, and even making Great Point into an island for a little while because of the high tides. Those tides and the winds also had an effect on Cape Cod. For those of you that don't know Nauset Beach, it's one of the most well-known beaches on Cape Cod. I think all the ones out on the outer Cape are the most popular. Nauset, Coast Guard, Marconi. Anyway, if you've gone there the last several years, you've seen the effect that erosion has taken over there, destroying the famous dunes. But the erosion of the dunes, the sand doesn't just go away. In many cases, it creates shoals right offshore, and they're like booby traps that grab a ship as it goes by. It doesn't matter how big the ship is. And that leads us to the 473-foot, 9,000-ton freighter named the Eldia. It was bound for Norfolk, Virginia. The Maltese ship had dropped off its cargo of sugar in St. John, New Brunswick, the previous day. The dropping off of the cargo ended up kind of being its undoing because the ship was lighter than normal. So the wind and the shoals off the coast of Nauset Beach came together and the ship was pushed to the shore. Luckily, the entire crew was rescued by a Coast Guard helicopter. The funny thing is about this ship grounding is that the Orleans Police Department received numerous calls of a nearly 500-foot freighter on shore at Nauset Beach, and they had received numerous false calls, so they kind of were like, I don't know if this is true or not. But after enough of these calls came in, they braved the storm and went out, and there it was, 473 feet. Its exact location back then was about a half a mile south of the main parking lot, and it was a huge attraction. More than 100,000 people went to see the ship during its roughly 7 weeks that it was on shore, including me. And it's one of those memories that, I was 6 years old, and I still can remember because the ship, it's bigger than anything I've ever seen. And my mother and stepfather brought me, my oldest sister, and then my brother, who was only a few months old. My twin sisters my mother was pregnant with them, and we all went down and we hiked our way across the dunes to see this ship, and there were people everywhere. You think Cape Cod beaches are crowded in the summer? Just imagine in April with a 500-foot ship offshore. They were everywhere. Pictures were being taken. News crews were there. If you go on YouTube and just type in Eldia, you will find news footage. I've watched it to see if I could see myself there. I haven't seen myself. The best footage, though, is this 22-minute video of the salvage of the Eldia. I'll put a link in the description of the podcast so you can watch it. It's unbelievable. So luckily, very little of the 140,000 gallons of fuel of the ship had leaked out of the Eldia before it was drained. So there wasn't any fuel spill. The task of removing the Eldia from Nauset Beach was given to McAllister Towing and Salvage of Montreal and Don John Marine Company of New Jersey. They had worked on removing the tugboat, the Morton S. Bouchard Jr., that had sunk in the Cape Cod Canal in April 1983. But it took a while, obviously, and by that time, more than 100,000 people had come to see that ship. You know, it was amazing. Every day, the parking lot was full, so Orleans was smart. They charged people for parking, and they made money hand over fist for people to just come and see this monstrous ship that was just stuck. There are obviously photos, postcards. Like I said, there's videos. It almost doesn't do it justice. Like, if you weren't there to see it, you can't imagine. It's like being in a shipyard and being next to one of those huge ones, and they're just floated there at the dock. Except this was on the beach. You could walk pretty close to it. Granted, I didn't get that close because, you know, with small children, my mother and stepfather weren't going to bring us way out a half mile and have us standing next to this huge ship because we likely wouldn't have wanted to walk back to the car. So they hedged their bets. A series of high tides beginning on the evening of May 13th, 1984, provided the perfect opportunity to slowly pull the Eldia off the sand and out to sea. I mean, the tide was so low and the ship was so big that its propeller was basically off the ground. It needed to be floated out so that its propeller could be in the water to move it. The process was slow, but by May 17th, the Eldia was safely away from the beach and was towed to a Staten Island boatyard. By the time it left, more than $80,000 had been raised from parking for people coming to see the Eldia. It spent 49 days on Nauset Beach and ended up being too damaged to ever be used again, so it was dismantled in a Rhode Island shipyard afterwards. It's hard to believe that was 37 years ago. I can remember, it's one of my vivid memories of my early childhood is going to the beach, but just how big the ship was from far away. A half mile away, it looked like it was right on top of you. It's like when you talk about famous storms from Cape Cod history, you know, the blizzard of 78, Hurricane Bob, the great New England hurricane of 1938, and the perfect storm of 1991. This great storm of March 29th, 1984 gets overlooked a lot. And it's amazing because not only did it wash the Eldia up on shore, but it knocked down Great Point Lighthouse on Nantucket, in addition to God knows what else damage it did that wasn't as publicized. But such is life living on Cape Cod, a peninsula that sticks out into the ocean. We're just ripe for storms. Do you remember the Eldia? Did you go visit it? I'd love to see other people's photos of it. I don't have any of my own, but there's photos and postcards and the videos. Definitely go check those out if you're not familiar with it. But that's a great slice of Cape Cod history from 37 years ago.